Je vais présenter maintenant Anne Lacaton.
I would like to introduce now you to Frédéric Druot, Anne Lacaton, and Jean-Philippe Vassal. We're a bit late, so thank you very much for your patience. So let's talk about the large-scale collective housing schemes, which were, around the 1960s, one of the greatest manifestations of urban globalization. They were in France. We know this because there are lots of French people here in this room. They were associated to the idea of progress. It wasn't the case everywhere in the world, but large-scale collective housing were like the cage of the French social ladder. But then this model collapsed under its own weight and rigidity. So it was decided to do away with it and to demolish it. But it's the empowerment aspect of this housing that we're destroying with it. Anne Lacaton, Jean-Philippe Vassal, and Frédéric Druot are working on restoring this. They learn architecture from Jacques Anglade is an architect who was a great conscience awakener in our country. Now, the question of housing for all, of affordable housing for all, brings them together. They all have explored their own avenues. It's the commitment that they showed in 2004 when the trio wrote a written manifesto, a very well-known text now, and they decided to refuse a policy of large-scale public housing based on demolition rather than restoration and refurbishment. Their position on housing is very clear. They think we should do everything but demolish. But in fact, there are two generations of thinking that are at the crossroads. They are very young still. They're still in their early 60s. They still feel empathy for modern liberal heritage. This is what they say. Plan libre would condense functions in a minimum block so as to offer around it some space, some light, and fluidity. In large-scale collective housing, we built the block, but we forgot about the space. But this is something we can fix. We can add the space later on. They still feel this empathy, but they've already understood, however, that the contemporary city is no longer, as it was the case in the 20th city, a city that has to be built after demolition. It has become an existing environment. It's a palimpsest that is complicated, that is stacked up, and it's the main resource of this environment. Let me quote them once again to conclude. Large-scale collective housing is here to stay. It is part of the scenery. When you look around you to find resources, there they are, available, recyclable. Our approach aims at extracting existing values and qualities from existing buildings without ideology to bring more comfort, light, and a wider view. My dear friends, over to you.
Merci. Merci tout d'abord.
Thank you. We would like to thank, first of all of the members of the Global Award for Sustainable Architecture panel. Thank you very much for presenting us with this award. We feel very emotional about it, and it's an opportunity for us to meet with the other award winners. And we could see that all over the world, whether we're talking about Thailand, whether we're talking about Peru, whether we're talking about Germany, or whether we're talking about Namibia, or whether we're talking about France, all over the place, we're all meeting as one around common shared ideas, a will to best spend this kind of energy. Thank you very much for this beautiful work. Thank you very much to the President of the City of Architecture and Heritage to welcome us for this presentation. It's an opportunity for us to present the outcome of our work. The purpose is to inhabit the space and to inhabit it in the right conditions. You want to be happy, you want to thrive, you want to show some hope by living in certain areas, and you want to thrive in these environments. And we don't want to pay too much. You don't want to pay unaffordable rent. You want to be able to afford buying your place. This is a beautiful challenge, isn't it, to make that affordable and possible for architects. Particularly interesting challenge. We want to inhabit a space, but not live in a minimum housing unit. We want to inhabit without thinking of housing units as financial products, as minimum living spaces. We want to find spaces where residents feel free, have choices, have possibilities, will reinvent new ways of living in these spaces. And we are sure that the minimum amount of space is never sustainable. If it's too small, it's not durable. So let me talk to you about the PLUS program. PLUS is the name. We want to add to what already exists. We don't want to demolish. We don't want to tear down what exists. We want to work on more together with the existing resources. We want to invent new ways, to create on top of what already exists. This is something I learned at the time when we were operating in the desert, in Sahara Desert, doing a lot with very little. This is what Martha said. We have few resources, let's do the most of them. Let us use whatever is available. Trees, people, life, history, the different stories that unfolded in a given environment. You should capitalize on all of this. You should use all of the possible situations, all of the spaces that you like and the spaces you don't like. Even more work has to be done in the spaces that are not liked, usually by people who don't live in them, but they're despised, and they have to be turned into something. You have to do with what already exists. When we talk about ecology, when we talk about sustainable development, well, then it seems fairly natural, of course, to make whatever exists last, to continue, to extend its lifetime. So talking about ecology, talking about sustainable development, we're not just talking about words here. We have to walk the talk, turn words into practice. This is a question of perspective. What is our outlook on these kinds of landscapes around cities, in the suburbs, in what we call the substandard, challenged neighborhoods? Are we only talking about big blocks scattered in the landscape? Is that all you see? Here we have Marina Vladi, an actress, Jean-Luc Godard, a filmmaker. They're on the balcony. Don't you think the scenery looks better all of a sudden? It's more pleasant with these two on the balcony. There are different ways of looking at things, different outlooks on things. Some people will say, there's nothing you can do to improve the situation. You have to demolish this. You have to transfer local residents. And these people would lose their friends. They would lose their neighbors in the process when they get transferred. Together with Frédéric and Anne, we want to prevent that from happening. For the last 20 years, we've been really taken aback and frightened by this way of engaging in such demolition work. Such violence is just incredible. Architecture or urban development can be extremely violent. We are no longer at the time of Baron Haussmann, who decided to destroy everything to build anew and to build the major avenues. I mean, especially talking about ecology and sustainable development, we have to do with what already exists rather than tear it down. So over and beyond pragmatism and efficiency, that are, of course, of the essence, we need to show some kind of understanding. We need to pay attention to what exists, and we need to be kind-hearted, kind at heart. And this word, kindness, is really of the essence. So, unfortunately, let us look at what has happened over the last 10 years or so. There's the ANRU, the National Program for Urban Renovation. Look at what happened between 2005 and 2015. There were about 21 billion euros that were spent just on, for 400 housing units. We have 16 billion euros devoted to demolition work and to reconstruction work as part of this budget. 124,000 housing units were destroyed in the process, and 100,000 were rebuilt, which means that if it was a bit of a caricature, we could say that with 16 billion euros, we lost 24,000 housing units at a time where we are trying to build more because we need more housing units, because we have more than 1 million families in France at this point looking for affordable social housing to house their families. So we are nonplussed. We fail to understand why this policy is being conducted. We need all of this money, of course, to be invested, but it's not being invested very effectively, as you can see. In addition to this, we have roughly 5 billion euros dedicated to 275 residents to engage in a traditional rehabilitation, as we've been doing this work for the last 30 or 40 years. And we know that this rehabilitation work will only last for about 4 or 5 years, simply because we keep having to demolish or redo or refurbish. We realize that, unfortunately, most of the buildings, the towers, blocks renovated in the 1980s are the ones that aged the worst and that had to be torn down first. So on this, together with Frédéric and Anne, we really tried to develop alternatives. This is what we call the Plus program, with the exact same amount of money. Rather than spending 164,000 euros per housing unit to demolish it and rebuild it, with 55,000 euros per housing unit, you could do the exact same thing, except that we will produce much larger, vaster living areas, offering a lot more pleasure and happiness to the local residents through transformation rather than demolition followed by reconstruction. So you have to look at things in a new manner. I mean, what we have right now looks like a prison, small windows. You have to look at things differently. We think we want to open up, give a new perspective, give more possibilities, and this brings us back to the case study house programs, program of the 1950s in the United States for affordable housing. One of the most beautiful villas on the east coast of the United States were created in the process. We have to go even one step further. We have to give more freedom. After the facade, you need some space. You need an extension. You want to create loggia, additional mobility that will give you more pleasure, more freedom, where you could go around the different cities where you live, wherever you are in the city, at whatever floor of the block or the tower. We want to transform, never demolish, always add, always extend, always give more space, to do more and better, because that's precisely this ambition that we need. We need to do much better than the standard housing unit, much better than the minimum, so-called minimum living space. In Bordeaux, in the Grand Parc area, we found a colleague who's also a friend, who shared his ideas with us. His name is Christophe Hutin. We just completed this project with him, building a 4,000 housing units. I was in the center of Bordeaux, and we'll tell you about this. Big towers, big rectangles that were refurbished. Back in the 1980s, we thought that all we needed to do was to paint the facade with bright colors, let's say green, yellow, and brown, to improve the life of the local residents, but really and truly, this color code was hardly enough. So you need to go one step further. We have to go back. We have to look at these buildings and these towers from a new perspective. You have to go inside. So these, there are 15 floors. In these buildings, they are 150 or 170 meters long. We have 500 families. So there are 1,000 rooms that are all different and that have an incredible richness and wealth in them. Wealth accumulated over 30, 40 years of life. People who patiently, every day, decorated, improved their living space and lived their lives within these housing units. So you have to go inside and start from there to improve. Yes, indeed, we have to start from within and forget about the shape and appearance for some time. We have to start from the housing units and look at the different situations, and there are 500 different situations. We visited these housing units almost one by one after the other, and we realized that every resident, every family built something different, and yet they had the same area, same livable area at first, and there's some added value given by these families to their housing unit. Now, what is missing? What should we add? What should be improved in order to transform technically the housing unit? How can we also improve the energy situation? But often, you know, you go inside and you forget that you're part of a big building, and this is the only thing you see. So what is missing, you might argue? We're missing some space, don't you agree? We're missing some space to feel more comfortable. You're missing some light, you're missing a view. You want to go out and you can't go out. You need a better facade to spend less energy. You need to renovate the lifts, the elevators, the bathrooms. You don't want to be closed off on yourselves. You don't want to be separated from the rest of the world and isolated. So you want to take the existing blocks, maintain the positive values, and be very ambitious and bold in the transformation process. You want to have inhabited spaces. The 530 families are there. There is no free housing unit to house them temporarily, and there is no solution. You can't transfer them in the neighborhood in any case. So you have to do it while they live there. So a choice was made to say, okay, we're going to try to add on what already exists, to improve on what already exists. We will touch only what has to be changed, and we have to do it as subtly and delicately as possible, avoiding interior restructuring, which is incompatible with family living there, and such refurbishment would cost a lot of money, and the remodeling money could be used to create more space. So we're not talking about renovation here, we're talking about adding space, and this changes totally the situation of these buildings. And these buildings that should, in fact, keep the intrinsic quality, i.e. the quality of the construction. This is 1/5 only of the major estate. We want to have an extension on the front by 4 meters, and this means adding space. You can open the space, you could go out, you could transform all of the windows into French windows, so that from the inside of every room you can move outside. You can use the winter garden and go in through different points, as you would do if you had a garden around your house, and turn these small, congested, large-scale collective housing buildings into villas, into houses that will use, add some possibilities. Especially we have these winter gardens that are places that could be used to develop a sense of appropriation. They have thermal capabilities because they will also help regulate the problem of energy consumption. We won't have to add, insulators on the facades. It's enough to have the garden. And we can capitalize on the climate, on natural resources, rather than cutting yourself off from these natural climatic conditions. And this, of course, implies that we need to work very systematically, very precisely. The basic principle is that we add space on the outside. We have construction modules that are extending all of the facades. No selection is made. All of the facades will have this. If adding space is good for one housing unit, it is true for all housing units, not for one room only, but for all the rooms. It is important for all the housing units to be transformed on an equal footing. So you never have to wonder about the fact that the form is different, the appearance is different, wouldn't warrant the addition of such space. It is good for everyone. And on the roofs, you have some flat surfaces that are added. You can add a few more housing units that can capitalize on all the new situations thus created. So this is the housing scheme before and after. Doing it on one side, adding space on one side was enough because all of the housing units had either a southern exposure or they had 2 exposures. And it was important because we didn't want to spend too much money. All of those taking part in the competition had to spend only an envelope of 40,000 to 50,000 euros per housing unit. Everybody was free to come up with their own solutions, but within that budget envelope. So we wanted to focus on what was a priority. So giving more space, giving more light was seen as a priority. The project was accepted. It was presented to the local residents and families, and a process was thus implemented. And there was a very strong collaboration with the Titanis, the project owner. So, of course, we knew that some disruptions had to be taken on board, and we followed this up very closely. So adding to things, this is the finished facade, and there was a possibility for the residents to use the winter gardens, and then remodeling was also done on the inside. We redid the bathrooms, the electricity. Sometimes we redecorated or remodeled when it was needed, and we worked on the elevators and on the lifts. So this is a construction process which is perfectly well regulated, very precise, and monitored very closely. We need this because it's on a huge scale, and we didn't want to waste a single day of work. We didn't want to be faced with difficulties, and that's why everything was planned ahead. And there was a commitment. The residents who wanted to stay in their houses, it was agreed, could during the day have an empty housing unit to stay, but at night they had to go back to their houses. So this is what we did to the facades with handrails. We changed the bay windows, and this had to last only 2 days for every housing unit, only 2 days. And of course, we needed a highly competent and skilled company. We need some high degree of monitoring and supervision, and we stuck to these construction times. And this, of course, also protects the buildings. To work within very strict time frames, and we didn't want to cause too much problems to the local residents. So there's a protection system inside so that we don't create too much dust inside. The asbestos joints were taken from the facade in the process, were removed, and this is the new facade that arrived, and the finishing work has still to be completed from the outside. So we moved from this kind of situation. This is the before picture with a window to the after situation where everything would be opened out onto a winter garden that is 4 meters long that could be used freely by the residents. And every resident will use it differently, of course. And we could see here, again, a diversity of situations. And this is a place where the creativity of families can thrive. And this is a place of the expression of creativity on the part of all these families. We're surprised because as soon as the space became available, it was owned in a way by the families. No explanation was needed. The space was used quite simply. By engaging in this transformation, we also transformed the neighborhood. This housing unit has been transformed, and there was a building next door who was going to undergo a similar renovation, and it changes the entire appearance of the neighborhood. So these housing units are transformed in a sustainable fashion because they are offering very generous space conditions, so more space, more light, a better view, a better climatic environment, less power being used, and collaborative work was done, very strict collaboration work involving the major partners, the client, of course, but also the project owner, the contractor, and also the residents who have to be involved in this process, and they are engaged, not as mere stakeholders that are informed once in a blue moon to be able to do the work, but they're also considered as fully fledged partners that do their own bit, not to build the project itself, not to be involved in the construction process itself, but to make sure that their rights as residents and their appetites are followed up very closely in this project and respected. So this project was very significant. Some discussions were held between people who rented and their owners. So additional facilities were given, better, more energy savings, quality of the housing. All of this meant that there was no increase in the rents. These are sustainably maintained buildings. They're no longer considered as places where you wouldn't want to live. There's a waiting list that is now very long of people who would love to live in these blocks. And we have a few housing units on the roof, some 10 flats, which have further improved the situation and capitalized on this. So precise, patient work has shown that these buildings that were going to be demolished were turned into something valuable. And it's a good thing because we now have living conditions that demolition followed by reconstruction would not have been able to contribute in such quality and quantity in this neighborhood in Bordeaux. Frédéric will talk to you about the Tour-le-Prêtre project. That was before the project we built in Bordeaux. It is in Paris or near Paris, and this was a sort of lab where we tested our solutions, things that we then developed in of the same nature. So let us talk about this. This is a rather similar project, same intention. Anne and Jean-Philippe have already said a lot about our approach, so I'll go quickly on this presentation to reach the end of the presentation of a second architectural project. We will talk about the question about the city itself. How can we move from architecture to urban developments? We could have a contraction of these two words and talk about architect-to-run environment, for example. This is a building that was completed by Prévost Lopez back in 1962. Raymond Lopez is an architect who in 1957 had developed a plan for Paris. He had to locate land to house people in the city and get them out of the slums. So he's a major architect who designed this building very well, but he's someone who was also trying to bring back to increase the livable space within cities. The tower was renovated back in the mid-1990s. You have the original building to the left, very similar to the building completed near Berlin. Back in those days, there was a lot of asbestos that was used, PVC windows that were installed, and you could see the chromatic range of colors used by Patrick. Then on the right, you see the project that we had offered. They wanted to demolish it at first. There was a competition that was organized right after the presentation of our booklet on the Plus project. Generally speaking, when we talk about demolition, very often we don't talk about heritage people, love stories unfolding in these buildings. We never talk about that. And yet we realize that there's a large degree of diversity, different of worship, different of culture, of spaces, different uses made of different living areas, things that have to be respected and for which no respect is shown by the demolition followed by reconstruction theory. Things of that sort. We also understood that there are some difficulties in organizing this building. A 7-year-old boy could easily jump out of this window, of course, so safety issues were also at stake. There were other problems with ventilation, with substandard bathrooms, but the overall question was on housing and the attention that we had to pay to the fact that there are people who have been living in these spaces for the last 40 or 50 years, and it is their home, it is their house, and their apartment, their flat means their entire life. And we don't want to demolish their lives, do we? We want to simply improve their living environments, bring in more light, more space, reduce the electricity bills, etc. The project was fairly straightforward. People, as per this project, were going to stay during the tower during the work. We didn't want to transfer people. We wanted to avoid having too many contacts with the inside of the buildings, but we wanted to add space, to add more fluidity, so more space, more light for every resident to give them enough space to thrive. There was to be no increase in the rent, as in Bordeaux, except that the general overall expenses were going to be increased somewhat. But less was paid in energy bills, as we said. So this is different from Bordeaux, however. There was a particular request put forward by families. Looking at the tower, when we started working, we started consulting with the families, we realized that there were real family-based needs. the tower could not really welcome all the people living in it. So before working on every housing unit, we had to work on the organization of new typologies and the question of the extension of the inhabitability of the building. That's why on the left-hand side you have the existing layout plans. There are two levels, not exactly on each other. And on the right, what we have suggested. In yellow, you have the extensions that we've suggested to house all of the people already living in the tower. So what we're going to do is increase the habitability capacity of the tower itself, and then give to everyone, to every family, not in a haphazard fashion, but give to all the families the ability to get out, to be in the open air, to have more light streaming in, and to have an expansion of space. It's easier than in Bordeaux. The facade is light, it is well designed, it could be removed very easily, and to replace it, to replace this light facade, you can actually organize the winter garden and the balcony, which is a bit smaller, however, than in Bordeaux, not 4 meters, a bit smaller space. That's why in Bordeaux we had more money and we built a bigger garden. So to the left, what already exists, and on the right, with the addition of a space at every level. Now, what's important here is the issue of the climatic conditions. Generally speaking, people talk about insulation. Insulation is always an objective, but adding 20 centimeters of mineral insulator next to every window is hardly sustainable. Nobody wants to add 20 centimeters of mineral wool. It's much better to have a winter garden on your balconies. This is much better, and the performance of this layout is much better than the insulator that you would be adding around your windows, and that we will have to remove 10 years from now because we know that its, polluting power is very high. So in the tower, differently from Bordeaux this time, in this project, talking about readjusting the capacities of all of the housing units to take care of the needs of the families, we needed to add space. So there's a particular complexity here. We're having to supply to every individual the right typology of housing unit within the tower. For example, there are some families that had a big apartment and they end up in a family of 2. So they want to have 2 small housing units rather than a big one because they have adult children, for example, or it could be the other way around. So 40% of the people decided to stay in their original apartments, and 60% of the people are going to rotate and take up other living spaces. We have to do this kind of work. We have to offer up new spaces, new flats to these families to see whether they would agree with the proposal extended to them. If we don't do this work, nobody will do this kind of work. If we don't do it, means nobody will do it, and the family will be told, no, there is no apartment for you here now, so you have to leave. It is part of our mission and assignment as an architect. All of this will have to be listed in registers. We have families who know their needs. Just to summarize now, we have a building, we have needs for additional rooms. We can build this as architects. We often add, because we're very generous, the winter gardens, and then we have to find flats that are suitable to the family sizes. So energy, we reduced the energy by 60%. The rent did not increase, and there's all-around accessibility to the housing units, including for disabled persons. So this is the tower, the work that was done, and this is now for one facade. In 1 month, we established a whole facade of balconies. The finishing work hasn't been completed yet, but that's how long it took. So this is what it looks now. This is the before picture. Back in the 1990s, we have the safety and security issue in France, and it looks like a prison. We decided, so that's why we decided to paint a little sun on the fence to make it look like a prison. But anyway, this is what it looks like now. This is the before picture. very convenient. At the end of the steps, you get some light, but this is what it's turned into. This is the before picture, very cluttered, but we could feel that there was a little love here, a little human attention going on, a story being unfolded, and this is what the housing unit looks like now. And the flat looks like this today. And of course, it's never the same because families don't use the winter gardens in the same way. Some people like to sew, other people like to have a drink in the evening. It's not our problem, it's their lives, isn't it? We're here to add space. We're happy to know and to see that little by little, in a different way than in Bordeaux, people decided to use their spaces. Some people were a bit hesitant. They used their winter garden in a way and then decided to change the furniture. You could see what the roof looks like here. You could have a view over Paris. This is what the apartment looks like. Spending a lot less to achieve a lot more. That's the motto, and I think everybody said it in different words. It's not enough to say during lectures and conferences. It's not policymakers who pay attention to these things who actually implement these policies. Some people continue going to Peru to fight on their own. Some people go to Médoc to fight on their own. And there comes a time where it's very difficult to stick to this kind of concept. You are young, but we're getting old. We're getting a bit long in the tooth. We are tired of being told, your project is great, but we'll do it some other day. We want to walk the talk. We started this issue on housing in 1995. This is when we started with the Plus project. We're very lucky because we did complete a lot of projects, 600 apartments, I think, out of hundreds of thousands that would still need to be remodeled and refurbished. So we should never demolish. You should never tear down a building. You should always build on top of it. I love these guys. You should never demolish anything. You should save on the cost of construction. Between the demolition, reconstruction, and the transformation and refurbishment, we would save about 62% of the budget, saving on energy. Here we're talking about grey energy. When we have a BBC low consumption building, here, of course, this means that you have to tear down everything. The grey energy spent would be 74%. So 70% less grey energy would be spent with our system. So, as we said, 240 housing units could have been built in this tower if we had decided not to demolish it. Minus 56%. What would that refer to, I wonder? That's what I just said. Okay, so building more. But we're much better than those who are in favor of demolition. We want to reduce the heating expenses. 60% would be saved in the process. There's an overall capacity for this tower. The transformation project we did, if we only consider the increase in the livable space in a rational way, it would mean that we would have won about 20 housing units on the tower itself by just thickening or increasing the space on a very small plot of land. This leads us to talk about urban development and city development. There are some subjects that keep coming back. We don't have enough housing units. We have thousands of people who are homeless, who are looking for a place to stay. We have the problems of financial access, of affordability. Rents are too high. Purchase prices are too high. How should we go about this? We've been hearing this for years and years. In 2008, the Greater Paris project was launched. I don't know why, but the question of housing was forgotten as part of this Greater Paris project. If everybody starts living in the suburbs and no one lives in Paris, it's going to be a bit of a problem. So we engaged in very meticulous, very precise research work coming from the Tour Bois-le-Prêtre experience, the first project project in Paris that we mentioned. In the project that we did, we knew that we had the capacity to have already 120 flats rather than 100, simply by working on the tower, on the building. Working now on the land plot around it, we realized that we can build an additional 30 housing units. So in a very small areas in Paris, by taking care of people, taking care of trees, by providing with large housing units, we can move from 97 to 130 or 140 buildings. We didn't demolish buildings, we didn't cut trees, we didn't have to rebuild streets, we didn't have to buy land because the land was already secured, which means the overall economy of all of this is much better, is much more positive than a mixed area, a zone that we would want to create. And this would mean building new roads, buying new land, etc. So this has to do with the quality of the housing units, and this gives you more economic capability. So we decided to do something that is pretty amazing. We tried to identify systematically all of the situations in Paris that could allow for this kind of project, where we could transform existing flats, 450,000 existing flats, and to increase on the existing territories about 135,000 housing units. We didn't come up with a project. We tried to evaluate very precisely the capacity of a city, of an organized territory, to increase the living density systematically. There are some situations where sometimes you can add 1 housing unit, sometimes 10, sometimes 40, but it's never done consistently or generically. There's a sheer diversity of situations. In Paris, we took the 22 municipalities around Paris because obviously when we go beyond the ring road, we're still in Paris. You could see blue or in red all of the areas where we could do some work and densify the population. Every situation is put in an inventory, and we draw up a sheet with the details of these pieces of land, and we see what can be done. You have to know the owner, you have to know the surface area exactly, you have to know a great many features and characteristics, and that's what we try to do. We try to evaluate the capability of every area, looking at the construction system, looking at the capabilities, looking at the regulations and the construction rules that were followed, plus the regulations, objective rules have to be complied. We want to keep the trees, keep the views, consider the situation of existing families who live in these flats. So we have descriptive sheets, and we could see, for example, on this side we could build 240 additional flats, and others only 22, and this gives us a total of 135,000 housing units, which means that the block plan, this is the aerial picture of Paris, it's exactly the same before and after. You're not adding any land, except that you will have densified and added 135,000. Beginning of the century, in Paris there were 3 million inhabitants. Today, only 2 million and a bit. Where has the other million gone to? So the quality of housing is important, but we have to look at capable urban situations. So we work like ants. We're looking very strictly at the different housing units. We could also do it at the scale of a neighborhood or a district. We wouldn't have to look at, mixed use areas, but you could say, okay, this is the walkable community. You could go to your subway station, to the taxi, for example, station, all around you, the neighborhood. Maybe we should look at these walkable communities and see what is the possibility to improve life in the neighborhood. Maybe there's something missing. Maybe there's a post that needs to be rebuilt. Maybe there are different scales of action that are possible. And generally speaking, if we looked at the Place des Fêtes square, for example, we saw that exactly there, in the 19th district in Paris, we could create another 2,000 housing units or flats without, buying new land, by simply improving existing housing spaces, that some activities could be created. So we could just improve the habitability of cities. And this is the kind of work that we do with a great deal of pleasure. We get tired in the process, but we derive a lot of joy from this activity. Thank you.